So, Spencer Murphy, National Portrait Gallery, Taylor Westing winner, 2013. I entered that year, you swine. He has shot for The Guardian Weekend, Telegraph Magazine, Time, Monocle, Wallpaper, Rolling Stone Magazine, GQ, Dazed and Confused. The list just goes on and on. And his work's been exhibited all over Europe and North America. It doesn't get better than that, really. Okay, so give me the microphone.
Okay, so I suppose when I saw the subject of today's talk, and I saw that I was speaking with Zed and Jane, I was sort of concerned, like, what do I add? There is something that unifies them, and not what I expected when they sort of said the subject was documentary photography. I thought, well, it'd be my personal projects, but they're all commissions. They're all studio portraits, so to some degree staged. 2 of the 3 of them are working with charities. So yeah, there's common themes and sort of not necessarily what I defined as documentary photography. So the first project was working with a charity, and an agency approached my agent on behalf of that charity. The charity's called they were called the Healing Foundation at the time, but they've kind of undergone a rebrand, and they're called the Scar-Free Foundation. So they came to me with an idea. My agent was involved in that process, and I kind of, and again, sort of the commonality with all the projects was that I had some amount of creative freedom, which in my editorial work and in my personal work is kind of always the case, but with a lot of stuff where agencies are involved, you're often kind of given the idea to turn into an image, and quite often you're given a drawing of the idea to turn into the image. But these are all exceptions to that rule, and so they came to me with the loose idea that they were going to change the name to the Scar-Free Foundation, and they had the idea that we'd do the ambassadors, which were people who, the sufferers of disfigurement, the doctors, the relations. But I kind of, because it was unpaid and because I had a bit more creative freedom, I kind of said, well, you know, if we concentrate on the doctors and the family members, I think it's just kind of the idea is going to get lost. So we concentrated just on the people who kind of had the injuries. And I suppose what I wanted to do was, I didn't, although I've chosen to do it in a studio environment against a flat background, I didn't want it to be really in your face. I wanted to sort of to show the humanity in these people, and the sort of disfigurement to be secondary to that. So I kind of spoke to the charity, and the process was that we had a meeting. I then spoke to the charity about what I wanted to do. We then went away. My agent and them agreed a budget and a timeline to how we'd make the work. And then they came up with a list of potential people. A lot of them were already ambassadors for the charity, but I felt it was really important to have kind of a wide cross section of people and a wide cross section of the sorts of injuries that they deal with. It's still kind of an ongoing project, so there are gaps within that. But for instance, she was a victim of an acid attack after her ex-boyfriend hired thugs to pour acid in her face. If we can go backwards. So she got bathwater burns when she was a baby. Similarly, I think she was 3 years old and was scalded. She was again a child and got her pyjamas caught fire, and she had 35% burns. And whereas you can just see she's got a prosthetic ear, the woman previous.
Sorry.
So that ear is completely false. She's now a doctor. This woman was injured. She had a gunshot wound to the face whilst diving to protect her wife, and then subsequently had facial cancer. So pretty interesting story. And then also had facial cancer and lost his eye, and he gave up on wearing a prosthetic and just wears an eye patch now. But What I've always tried to do, and I think what I sort of tried to sort of impart on the students this morning, was I always tried to do something a little bit unexpected. So I didn't want it to be really stark and in your face, and I didn't want the people to kind of also look like victims. I just wanted them to be humans and treat them as I would any other sort of subject matter that I'd take into the studio. But I also wanted them to be kind of soft and so I shot them on 5:4 film, and so this is again going back to like why I didn't sort of, this was unexpected as contemporary documentary photography, was that, you know, these are lit, they're styled, they're directed. I shot them on 5:4 film, I chose the background, they came to the location, so it's not classically what I expect to be termed as documentary photography. Which I suppose then, if we go on to the next subject, and this really stretches kind of the ideas of documentary photography, and I probably wouldn't term it as documentary photography. In 2013, I was approached by Channel 4, and they were promoting the Grand National for Channel 4 Racing, and they've got an advertising arm called 4 Creative. So an art director came to me with an idea about how we celebrate the jockeys who are like these unsung heroes of horse racing, because they're so seldom seen because they're wearing goggles and hats and they're all tucked down, so you never really see them celebrated. And they wanted to show the tagline was the original extreme sport, because these guys go to really extreme lengths in pursuit of their sport and their athletes. So the focus was purely on them. Again, it was a little bit more restricted process, but I still had creative freedom, and we were both very keen to make them look as real as possible. But again, I think with background information, it kind of heaps meaning, and I've always been intentionally vague about these photographs because I don't like people to kind of have a sort of a prejudice when they view them. So I think most people would kind of view this initially and they'd see kind of maybe a day-lit documentary project. But in actual fact, to get the extreme conditions we wanted, these are all staged. So the mud, he was the only one that was actually racing that day. So we were at a race course and we recce'd the changing rooms, but in reality the changing rooms weren't that great, the access wasn't going to be that great. So we needed the ability to pull people off the race course. So we built a changing room next door in a cafe, and some of the people like Daryl, I think, was racing. So he was the previous year's Grand National winner. But if we go back to Katie, so she wasn't racing, she came especially for the shoot. We chose the silk, so I chose the colour of the background. The art director and myself researched mud spatter and how that reacted, and the sort of shaping of the skin and the dry lips. So all of this is recreated. And the final photo of AP McCoy was, he very famously got kicked in the face. Is there one more? No. Oh, okay. AP McCoy's not up there, but there's a picture of a guy with a scar running up, like a fresh scar running all the way up his face, where he got double kicked in the face, and that was all prosthetics. So I suppose my point is, is this documentary? I'm not sure. And then your knowledge of that information maybe affects how you perceive them. But I think they're still honest. They are retellings of things that actually happened. They just didn't happen when we photographed them. So they're sort of making a documentary film and making a reenactment, that sort of thing. So on to the final stuff. This was again a charity. This was for Save the Children. So an art director there came to me with the idea that they were going to launch their first UK campaign, which they'd never done before. And she wanted to do like a photo booth situation in all the most impoverished areas in the UK. And again, it was a discussion. It wasn't like we have to do this. So I kind of said, well, for me to be involved, it kind of needs to be more photographic than that. I don't want to just kind of set something up and go away. So we decided instead to I'd build a studio and collaborate with the kids on how they'd have their portraits taken, and then sort of to add to that, they then wrote a statement on what they thought it was like to be in poverty in the UK. So it was like an inclusive thing where they would come, they would talk to Lynn for a while, they'd write their piece, and then they'd come and we'd sort of agree on a photograph and take the photograph together. So yeah, the idea developed into this, and so the reality of the situation was we had 2 days in a boys and girls club in Poplar. I set up a studio, so I probably spent half of the first day just setting up my lighting in the studio, and then kids it was kind of a boxing club and a youth club, so kids that would come there every day, and this was like, it's the most impoverished district in London and one of the most impoverished places in the country. So the kids would then come and have their portraits taken, write their piece, and then I took the pieces away and re-photographed them, so they'd be shown as diptychs alongside each of the children. So I suppose what working, the thing I was talking about, what unified them, and them all being commissions, what that kind of offered me as opposed to doing my personal work was they kind of offer you a support network. So working with the charities, they do a lot of the legwork for you. They contact the people, they make the access possible. Whereas, and I think me and Zed were talking about it over lunch, was if you're doing this personally, like I'd say 90% of the time is spent in front of the computer trying to either raise money or get access granted. And I spoke to a lot of the students this morning about sort of that being a very difficult thing, especially when you're in education. If access takes you a year, then you've got no time left to make your project. So what working with a charity or someone like Channel 4 does for you is it gains you access that you would never normally have, and it offers you, so probably from 10% of your time spent on creativity, it turns into like 50 or 100% of your time, because you just have to think about the pictures. So that's kind of the nice thing about this, and I've always taken, when I take on commissions like this, I don't take a different approach to if it was my personal work or if it was a job for Channel 4. I'm always want to create something that's like could be seen as art and could be seen as commercial, and has a soul as aside from that. The question I suppose it all raises is what is contemporary documentary photography. Like, I personally don't see the Channel 4 stuff as documentary photography, but I don't mind if someone does. What's nice is that it's been accepted as art, and it has been, maybe it's misleading to think that it's documentary, but people have accepted it as documentary, and I quite like that vagueness, to not add prejudice to it by telling people that this was all staged, because I don't think it matters. It is a reenactment. And to the same degree, I still influenced these pictures. I still lit them. I still told them where to stand when they look at the camera. That's still a staging of an image. So I mean, it's not the same as going into their environment and taking a stolen photograph of them. But I think somehow it makes them more potent and makes you it strips the image back and makes you concentrate on the subject. So I think I'm always looking for an original way to tell a story, and not necessarily, say, for instance, with the work with the scars. I don't necessarily want to shock someone, because I think all that does is make me want to look away from the picture. I'd much prefer someone sees a beautiful picture and then engages with the story and spends time with it than, I think we're so kind of trained to seeing things like disaster porn and that sort of thing, where you just, your initial reaction is to look at something hideous and look away. I'd much rather make a hideous subject look beautiful and engage people for longer. I think that's probably about all the speaking I'll do, but I'd love some questions if people have questions. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question about your process, in the process of you taking your images.
Yeah.
It's very purposeful in the way you like them and your intentions. But when you come down to the final selection, how do you select that one image from the shoot as a representation?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes, like I often have a preconceived idea of how I want a picture to look, but a lot of it does come down to the edit. So, and I mean, these are all shot on film. The Save the Children stuff was shot on medium format film, and both the other projects were shot on large format film. But because I was I had agency with me. I did shoot them digitally as well, so they saw a digital image on the screen, so they were happy that they were getting what they wanted. And then I kind of took my 5.4 or my medium format and then shot what I wanted to shoot. But interestingly, the agency still picked the film stuff that I loved, and the digital stuff was kind of just seen as like Polaroid. I've only done that a few times. Like usually, it has to be one or the other. But I suppose in answer to your question, it's kind of a 50-50. Like I know when I'm shooting it what's working, but then there'll be surprises afterwards when you get the contact sheets back. There'll be, and you kind of just have a guttural reaction to something that's what you wanted.
Working class. Whereas within your images, it's almost the antithesis of that, and they become almost classless. And I was wondering if that was intentional.
Yeah, I think it's kind of across the board intentional with my work. Is like there's this horrible term that they use in America about poverty porn, where people kind of go out and sort of all kind of swarm on the impoverished areas. And I didn't want it. I wanted it to be more empowering for them. It was like I didn't want to kind of it's always hard because you know you're a photographer and you've got to convey a message. But again, like, as with the scar stuff, I didn't want to kind of go, oh yeah, these are the poor children, feel sorry for them. I wanted kind of it to be ambiguous enough for it to be an open narrative, but also explicit enough for you to get what the subject matter was about. And I think that what they've written was kind of enough that the portraits didn't have to be that poverty porn.
Should we stop there and then save more questions for the end?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so thank you. Sorry, it's been a fumbling forward.
Hi. I'm going to go, actually Paul, I'm going to go straight into one of the documentary films I shot for the BBC. It was a 10-part series, so not that.
No, I'm not going to find it.
And it was shot in 2000 and it took 2.5 years to do 10 films. And I lived for the best part of a year in 2 different brothels in Nevada. So I was pretty much out of the way, which is the best way to learn your subject matter. I'm not suggesting go to a brothel, but you know what I mean. So I'm going to show, if you want to, this is 1 of 10, and this is the Pimp Master General.
The Players' Ball is a convention for pimps. Held once a year in Chicago, it's the social event of the year for all the big players, their hoes from the street, and rap artists like Snoop Doggy Dogg.
Hey players, here it goes. Hey, give me that pimp music. I've got hoes in different area codes.
It's the pimp equivalent of the Oscars. Awards are given for excellence and outstanding achievement.
Is it cause they like my gangsta wall? Gangsta wall. Is it cause they like my gangsta tall? Gangsta tall. Is it cause they like my handsome face? Handsome face. Is it cause they like my gangsta way? Gangsta way. See you right behind you, security behind you. Come on.
Ronnie, get him on stage with us, come on.
Man, they got real pimps around here.
Dennis Hoff owns 2 brothels in the state of Nevada. He's been invited to the ball with his porn star girlfriend, Sunset Thomas.
And y'all know Dennis Hoff from the Bonnie Run. Yeah. Sunshine Thomas. And listen,
His relentless promotion of legalized prostitution earns him respect among the players.
Man, this nigga got 250 hoes deep. 250.
Dennis has 250 girls on his books because he can. Nevada is the only state in America where prostitution is legal. Rappers have made pimp culture cool. It's an illicit world traditionally dominated by blacks with attitude.
Don't stop. I need a rap name of any big pimp, huh?
Dennis is the only white pimp recognised by the players.
Ain't no party like a bunny ranch party, cause the bunny ranch party don't stop. Y'all say it. Ain't no party like the bunny ranch party, cause the bunny ranch party don't stop. Ain't no party like the bunny ranch party, cause the bunny ranch party don't stop. Yo, right. Ain't no party like the bunny ranch party, cause the bunny ranch party don't stop. How about this? There ain't no titties like sunset titties, cause sunset titties don't stop. Y'all say it. Ain't no titties like sunset titties, cause sunset titties don't stop. Ain't no titties like sunset titties, because sunset titties don't stop. It's all they real too. And they real too. Holes to the right, holes to the left. 5 holes this time. Woo! Oh no!
It's a prestigious invite into a closed world. Pimps come from all over the states to receive awards from their peers for the truest, the most promising, and the most consistent pimp of the year. The biggest award of the night goes to Pimp Jojo and his harem of 8 girls.
Alright, Pimp Jojo, the new king of the pimp. Pimp Jojo.
All the pimps in the house, keep doing what you're doing, cause y'all got the spirit moving in the rap game, and we loving y'all for what y'all do. God bless y'all and God keep you. Pimp, 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 church.
There may be respect for the white boy from Nevada, but there's no award for him to take home.
And they made us feel like we were homeboys.
That's right, homeboys.
We were like part of the hood.
We are in the hood, brother. And they had every hood rat in the world was there tonight, believe me. But what fun. Very flamboyant. It's a part of America that nobody will ever see. And I love it. I've never seen so many mink coats. I'm going to have an air conditioner in my mink coat. I'm going to have one special made with an air conditioner.
I always wanted to be a pimp, but it always cost me money.
You're selling pictures of girls.
No, but I tried being a pimp when I was 19, man. I mean, I had this hope, and I thought I was the greatest God gift to women, you know? I mean, she took me to school, man. She cost me a fortune. I didn't make a dime. So I gave up my pimping career a long time ago.
Stuck taking pictures, huh?
Okay, so that was just a very tiny slice. It's a bit flamboyant, this one, but I've already shown at Bournemouth a couple of others that are more female dominated, so I thought it'd make a change to have something a bit different. But this led me to, on a documentary basis, to do the book Precious. After the films, and I'd recovered, I was able to do a book of portraiture about the women because I felt like it was unfinished business for me. So I returned to Nevada literally 10 years later to shoot portraits of the women that lived and worked in brothels. I came to this is a typical brothel in the middle of nowhere where people go to have sex, which was always fascinating to me, not least because it was legal and they all paid taxes and all sorts of things. So I did Precious there, which took me 2 years, and which was another reason to do it, because most of documentary work is based around access, and having already spent many years getting access and shooting films, it meant that I would take 2 years to shoot Precious rather than a normal 15. So I did a portrait book on some of the women. So all the women were, a cross section from young, old, white, black, and fat, thin, you name it. And that was part of its charm, I would say, because I wanted to show really the girls looking more like portraits rather than hookers. So this one probably doesn't do that, which is why I ended up taking the clothes off for most of the portraiture. So I ended up doing a whole series of nudes in the end because the clothes misled their true personalities to me, and I wanted to get close to them and really to show them as real people, not necessarily as prostitutes, as their job. So I travelled 11 different brothels over 2 years and did a cross-section of girls. As you can see, this one's pregnant, obviously a bit controversial, and that was very difficult. But it did show all sorts of different people who decided to work in the brothels. This, if you go back, that one in particular, which I'm always asked about, she was young and sweet and about 18, I think, and she had just decided to go into a house of prostitution because she did a job on the road where she was a flagger, and I thought that was probably some sexual thing that I didn't know about. And as it turned out, she flagged the construction workers down to slow them down, and she thought it was more dangerous to do that job, so she went into the brothel for full-time work while she was pregnant. So, because she thought she'd get knocked down. This is Ruby. She's got a young son at home, and it was her first time working. All of them have a story, but I decided in the book, I did portraits of them, and all the stories are in the back. And because I didn't want to taint the viewer by seeing the story next to the picture, so I felt that if you really wanted to know about these women, you should hunt it in the back because it would be a privilege. So that was precious. And I'm trying to make this talk short and sweet because I know I'm just going to cover 2 projects. And you can ask me at the end, I'm sure you'll be better asking questions. And then in between the films and Precious was a project called Dead Eagle Trail. This is Jeremiah Carston, and I was travelling around the States at the time, and I was commissioned by the Times to go and photograph this young cowboy who was 19 at the time. And he travelled 2,500 miles on horseback from Alaska to Mexico. He crossed the border, and it took him 2.5 years, and so I went back to photograph him. In fact, you can freeze it here. This is him bringing the horses back. He basically earned his keep by breaking colts that he used to find rolling around in the landscape and then selling them into ranches. And by doing that along the roadside, by the time he'd broken one in, it took him 6 weeks, he'd earned enough money to continue for the next 6 weeks. He was very charismatic, and he returned to Cortez in Colorado because he'd met somebody along the way after he'd done this amazing trip of 2,500 miles on horseback, and settled down there. But when I met him, he introduced me to an old cowboy, in fact, which is Johnny, and I went to his house here, which you can freeze. And obviously I was invited to supper while I was shooting Jeremiah, and obviously I walked into his house and went, right, okay, I've got to come back and do your portrait, because I don't think I'd ever seen a cowboy's house. And I realised then that nobody normally does see cowboys' houses, and that in actual fact their homes were much more interesting than seeing them dotting off into the sunset riding on a horseback. So I decided to do this book on cowboys at home, really, and basically clutching onto all their Western artefacts and how they bring the exterior inside their homes and how they live with it and how they basically can't do without it. And it is a lifestyle, obviously. They don't earn loads of money, and they love what they do. And in fact, this is Cotton Logan, who basically, he said the day he can't get on his horse is the day that he'll die. And I know that to be true in some circumstances. This is a young cowboy, 19, and they all start off as ranchers, and it was the most magnificent project to do because obviously it enabled me to tour around the States in my Mustang and meet cowboys and yes, see their lifestyle. And yeah, this is I've forgotten his name now, Pate Menza, who's also extraordinary, very young with a young family. Obviously, he's at home on the marital bed. A lot of people think he looks a bit gay, but he's not. And in fact, you can't mention Brokeback Mountain over there. They don't talk about it. And this is Wyoming, and this is just one of many landscapes that I did. So they were two fairly big projects, but I would say Dead Eagle Trail, I probably could have done that for another 5 years, but the publisher basically stopped me short and said, we really need to publish it now. So there were a few states that I missed off, but in general, I would say, yeah, the documentary projects, you do really, really have to know it really well, and the more time you spend knowing your subject matter, waiting your time, not being too impatient, I think it kind of, speaks for itself, and I think you get that back in the end. Yeah. Any questions? I'm keeping it short, I don't know.
That's fine. Question at the back?
Jane, I just wondered, did doing the prostitute project change your viewpoints on the whole legalisation of prostitution?
I've never really spoken about what I feel about it, because I always think that I've shown it to people. I very much would like to think that I'm non-judgmental, and in fact I'm extremely non-judgmental, and I think that you shouldn't really make judgments on things you know nothing about. And that's another reason to show a different angle to something that people have preconceived ideas about. But push comes to shove, I certainly don't see any reason why it shouldn't be legalised. It's not going away, and it was safer definitely than some of the other situations I've been in.
To me, there's quite a stark contrast between the film and Precious. Do you find working with like a production company or the BBC, you have to make compromises in terms of how you approach it stylistically? I mean, it feels quite different.
Yeah, I mean the films were made before the books, to be honest, and I think I was using stills in the films, which was quite difficult to marry different formats. In fact, the films had 4 formats in them. I was shooting Digibeta at the time, it's a bit old-fashioned, and a PD-150, and I was doing 16mm, and I was doing stills. And so it was a kind of patchwork, which gives it a different feeling completely. It gives it a whole different vibe. Whereas both Precious and Dead Eagle Trail are all, like Spencer, 5x4 colour negative film, and it's a whole different process. And it was probably a reaction to doing the films, to be honest, which was so fast and furious, and you're trying to get people's stories over immediately. And so I kind of withdrew a bit and wanted more time with my subject matter, and 5/4 actually is the perfect thing to enable to do that, because especially for the girls, it is a form of therapy. So you're talking to them while you're fiddling about, setting up a camera, and they become relaxed during the process, and you get a different, I would say, considered image rather than, you know, rattling something off, so to speak. But yeah, so the films were different, but I mean, you know, the BBC obviously had a lot to do with what they didn't like, and they wanted more sex in it, and I was trying to pull it out. But that's very media, you know, those sex cells, I suppose. Yeah. Does that answer that?
Okay, thank you very much, Jane.
So I've got enough time to show a couple of clips of films at the end. And I thought I'd show you work from the 3 books I've done and tell you, I'm interested in why we do things and how one thing often leads to another or informs another project. So I'm going to start right at the beginning with the first book I did, and then right up to the latest one. So the first book I ever published was called Gun Nation, about America's love affair with a gun and how the sort of consequences of that love affair, which is huge annual death toll. I'll go into that in a minute. Following that, I published a book called Love Me, which is about sort of human vanity and how the beauty industry have really exploited something within us very effectively to make us dissatisfied and insecure about ourselves in order to sell us cures to these perceived problems. So I'm going to go into that project as well, and then more recently I produced this book called Portrait of Hackney, which was a much simpler, in a way more personal, local project, which was done very much as a result of having spent a lot of time working on Love Me, which had been a sort of, I'd shot that in 17 different countries, and it become, I was really sick of travelling and inhabiting that world. So this was a project that was to sort of bring me back, in a way, down to earth and into my local sort of neighbourhood. This is a book, it's so limited edition, I only ever published one single copy of it. They all went horribly wrong at the printers, so I won't go into that for now. But and then I like to show this image because it was the first picture I ever took that was published, and it kind of always reminds me why I not became a photographer, but what interested me about being a photographer. This was shot in London, in Trafalgar Square, and it was a kind of gleeful moment for me where everything spiraled out of control. There was a riot, a demonstration that turned into a riot against Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister. And so this was published, and as a photographer I'd been there partly as a demonstrator and also as a photographer, and I kind of shifted from a student to a professional in a way that day. And this is in many ways a portrait as well, and I realised that even in sort of very sort of documentary situations I would often end up shooting portraits, and I always have done. And so after that, when I left college, I went to, this was in Somalia, and at that time I was kind of very tied up in this idea of documentary photography in the kind of traditional, slightly old-fashioned sense as we see it now, which is, you know, shooting black and white. You know, we'd often go off to sort of developing countries and feel that we were righting wrongs and sort of saving everybody. Quite, in a way, an arrogant idea and a naive idea as well, that somehow over the years has become a little bit more suspect. We've realised that, you know, the great white saviour of Africa is a flawed concept. But nevertheless, you know, I don't mean to discredit serious reportage work in any way, but I do think that we have to really question why we do things and what our reasons and motivations are. And so that process of doing that began for me here. And I sort of fell into the most extreme situation where there was a famine and a war and people dying all around me, and I was totally ill-equipped for that. But nevertheless, I had this one thing to cling on to, which is idealism, you know, the idea of photography being a really useful tool. And again, you know, this is a portrait, but what I realised on this first trip was that, you know, this carnage all around me wasn't created for the simple reasons, the sort of simplistic reasons that we read about, that these weapons that were fighting the war had all been donated by foreign governments who were playing games in that country. And these weapons, I realised, were from our own countries, were from Britain and China and Russia and America. And I learned a lot in this process, and it made me quite angry and confused. You know, for instance, when I made photographing images of famine, I'd realised that there was food, plenty of food around, and that it was much more to do with economics and who had the power. So I didn't know how to tell that story as a photographer at that time. I'm still struggling with it even now. But what it did do is it made me want to look at more complex stories that weren't just kind of easy, sort of slightly sensational, simplified versions of truths. So I went to America and I'd photographed several conflicts. I'd been in Angola and Somalia and Afghanistan. And I started getting really angry because the story that underpinned them all, as I said, was these foreign governments just pouring weapons into these countries and fighting their own wars for power. And so I realised that in America that there was a war going on that no one was even thinking about or discussing or framing in the way it needed to be seen. I looked at the statistics, and 30,000 people were shot and killed every year. And that number has remained the same. It's actually worse than when I did this. So I wanted to look at that issue and say, you know, there's a war going on in America, it's a civil war. And I also wanted to sort of stop looking at Africa and the developing world in that kind of black and white foreigner's perspective, and to start looking at our own cultures, looking at the Western cultures in a much more critical way. And so this was the beginning of that process. This is Mike and his baby. He said, it's my constitutional right to own a gun and protect my family. So this project, I began to use text, interview people, the style of photography I began to consider differently as well. This is lit. It's effectively a studio portrait with studio lighting, but I would travel with this equipment and I would set it up. This was in a gun store in America, and so he would come in and I'd get introduced and photograph someone quite spontaneously, but under quite carefully constructed lighting. And it has the sort of echo of a family portrait in a way. This is a group of Memphis housewives at home with their new guns. And again, in the book and the exhibition and the magazine stories that came out of it, the text was important, their opinions and the dialogue. This is Sarah Reed, and she said, I got a 410 shotgun from Santa Claus last year. And so the design of these captions with the images was important to me. And I wanted to, the framing of images, this shows, obviously bullets in a very kind of sold in a very everyday consumerist way, like sweets. And I was beginning to also think about this project mixing, in terms of style of photography, I was mixing these medium format lit portraits with reportage, more traditional documentary images, with sort of detail shots which were constructed more like, almost like product shots, and mixing them all in the same project as a way of trying to sort of shake out of this documentary language that felt like it had become a bit stale, even then, to me. And again, this couple, John and Kaywin Lanu, her clutching her little gun. It could be, again, a family portrait, the way it's kind of constructed and set up. So I wanted people to almost relate to the images, but also be disturbed by them. This was in a hospital. I spent a week in a hospital like a vulture, really, just dressed in scrubs, waiting for gunshot victims to come in Memphis. And the project also, what I wanted to do was explode some of the myths about guns in America. When I tried to pitch the story to magazines in order to fund it, People were amazingly uninterested at the time, and they were like, yeah, you know, we've heard it, we've done it, we've seen it, you know, gang members, crime, you know, these were the things. The gun problem in America was equated with gangs. And so what I decided to do was to do the project without showing any gangs and any crime in the typical sense. I wanted to look at kind of white, middle-class America, the people who make, produce, advertise and buy the guns largely. This is John Wayne, sort of cardboard cutout. And I wanted to look at how the sort of mythology of the gun, how this idea of it as being a sort of symbol of freedom and power, where that came from, that kind of idealised view of it. And obviously show how, you know, younger generations are brought in and sort of indoctrinated by the same idea of it. This was a president of a gun company. I remember, you know, it's very, very difficult to get access to photograph people who sell guns. They were clever enough to know that it was usually going to end up being bad publicity. So I went to this gun convention in Dallas and spent a couple of days walking around with a 35mm camera. Everyone told me to fuck off and no one would, you know, allow me to photograph them. People were incredibly hostile. They saw me as a sort of, you know, probably like a left-wing newspaper photographer. So on the second or third day I went in early and built a studio with a backdrop and loads of lights and umbrellas and, you know, put up more equipment than I even needed. And then people, it was pure sort of psychology. They saw me as part of the show, you know, like a sort of part of the gun show. And people literally queued up at my booth as if I was, you know, I had a monkey to put on their shoulder. People queued up, they came and asked to be photographed, and I was like, yep, come in, go and get your best-selling gun. And a lot of photography, I think, is to do with psychology, how you approach people, how people perceive you. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. Again, even in a gun store, just on a basic sense, if I walked in with a camera, people were very suspicious, very awkward. But if I'd been in the gun store for several, you know, an hour or two, and then people walked in and saw me chatting to the owner, I was perceived as a very different kind of person. Again, very simple but effective way of getting people to agree to be photographed. So this is a family buying a gun in an LA gun store. He's buying his gun for his wife as a present for home protection. You know, it's effectively a semi-automatic assault rifle designed for mass warfare, jungle warfare. And this was obviously shot under lighting. Again, I wanted it to have this, you know, the sort of echoes of a product shot, the way things are advertised and sold to us. But these are hollow point bullets, which means they don't have a point. When they hit you, they fragment, break up, spread around your body, pieces fly in different directions, just tear you to pieces inside. They're banned by the Geneva Convention, so the American military aren't allowed to use them, but they're the best-selling bullet in America. The police use them, and most civilians buy them for their own guns. And so again, this image, you know, quite seductive, and then underneath it would have a very discreet caption which would give you another layer of information. This is Dr. Francisco, coroner. There's a dead woman in front of him. Again, this came with the fact that, you know, most people who have guns at home think they're protecting themselves. Statistics suggest that you're much more likely to be shot if you have a gun in your home in a domestic argument or a kind of accidental shooting. So I wanted to sort of explode take these facts and these myths and confound people with the truth. This is the #1 victim group of guns in America, white middle-aged men, but they commit suicide. This is a shot of a suicide victim. You can see the bullet in the brain. So a huge number of gunshot victims are self-inflicted suicides. And white middle-aged men also like shooting their feet off in hunting accidents with high-velocity hunting rifles. there's a small subculture of prosthetic legs for that. And then towards the end of the project, the Columbine High School shooting happened, where 14 children, teenage kids, had been shot by 2 of their classmates. So it was one of these big massacres in a school, completely difficult to understand, no warnings, and this has happened repeatedly ever since. So I flew out there, and then I watched the aftermath, which was always the same. And all of these school shootings, you know, pray for healing, this kind of religious outpouring, you know, people saying, we thought we were in the safest place in America. These sort of things that are parroted over and over again, but no actual action to try and change the problems. Down the road from the school, from the Columbine High School where the shooting had happened, local gun shop carried on selling guns, business as usual. And so that was Gun Nation, and so this was like some time ago now. And then after that, after the following years, I started getting interested in another subject, which was ended up being a book called Love Me, which was very much about the human obsession with beauty, in a way. As I said, it was about how an industry have really manipulated and brainwashed us into believing certain things are true. This is a sort of, I was interested in this idea of a Western ideal of beauty as well, which this picture in many ways kind of embodies. Blonde hair, blue-eyed, fair skin. And this Western ideal has been kind of harnessed and packaged by the beauty industry and sold to us as being, you know, the pinnacle of what we aspire to as being beautiful. But worse, they've now sold it and they've exported it all around the world as a form of sort of globalization. And that's what really interested me in this project. So I ended up having to go to 17 different countries to try and tell that story. This is in Iran. I'd heard that nose jobs were a booming kind of industry. And you know, doing a project in 17 different countries poses real problems about how do you fund it. With Gun Nation, it was all in America. I probably went there 5 times. I tried to pitch it as a project, couldn't really get enough money or get anyone interested in it. One magazine was interested, but then they said, we want you to shoot it all in colour, and I'd already got halfway through, so it was absurd. So I just did that one and then sold it, and it sold well, and it was published in lots of magazines, so I sort of made my money back, but it was a gamble. With Love Me, I knew that would be impossible, so I tended to do it in kind of chapters. I would do a story, say Iran, and I would pitch it to a magazine and get just enough money to shoot that kind of segment, and then often use only one image for the book or the exhibition. This is in Brazil. I was interested in how beauty is sort of sold to us like a new religion. This is Christopher in New York. He just had a chest wax. So again, I was interested in how men are now being really influenced and manipulated in the same way that women have been. The beauty industry have sold, they've worked on women's mindsets for decades. They've convinced people that they have to smell a certain way and remove their hair and lighten their hair and everything else, remain youthful. Men now are seen as a sort of target group, huge group to exploit. You can get men just as paranoid about their looks. There's an enormous sort of potential for commercial gain. So I was very interested in that in this project as well. This, I don't know if you can read it, says, we refrain from questioning the status quo because we associate what is popular with what is right. This is by Alain de Botton. So it's this idea that if things just surround us, if they become the status quo, if they become perceived as normal, we no longer question them, they just are right. And that's what interests me about this project. And also about Gun Nation. These are subjects that they're so kind of around us we're so immersed in them that they become invisible, that we don't even realise how they're working on us. This is a breast implant factory. This is under 60s disco in London. And I mean, this image, you know, what I was surprised to find was that the girl, she's 13 years old, already sort of sexualised, and the beauty, the sort of porn industry is also playing, having quite a strong effect on us as humans, the aesthetics. It's feeding into the fashion and entertainment industries as well. So this girl's in a Playboy suit. This is the Kremlin in Russia, which has become an underwear billboard. This is a woman waiting to have a bikini wax. I wanted the book, or the project, to not give people an easy way out. I wanted people to see themselves in the work, rather than just be a kind of parade of freaks or extremes. I wanted to really work hard to find images that force people to realise and understand that we're all part of it, that we're all being affected and playing our parts in this. This is a blonde hairpiece. In the book it came with quite a serious little piece of text which talks about how blondness and fair skin, you know, hundreds of years ago in Britain there was a sort of pseudo-anthropologist who talked about how blondness and fair skin is equated with intelligence and godliness. And he drew up a scale, a chart, as if it was science, which had black people at the bottom and white people at the top and Aborigines sort of 3/4 down, with this sort of pseudo made-up nonsense about intelligence and sort of godliness. It was all made up, absolutely absurd, but it's stuck. It really has stuck over the years of colonialism and kind of, you know, the societies have just absorbed these ideas. Barbie doll was invented in the 50s. This is in Japan, where you have a Barbie doll department store with life-size Barbies. This is British woman, Miss Hull, from the Miss England competition. This is South Africa. This is Oxenangelo. He's a plastic surgeon in Brazil with his wife, who he sort of performed many procedures on, his sort of home project. This was a woman who'd had vaginal surgery. Agonising, you know, point in the project for me. You know, oh God, I'm going to have to do that one. I thought this would be impossible. Turned out not to be. Everything I always think is going to be really difficult turns out to be easy, and all the easy things turn out to be extremely difficult. She'd had vaginal surgery, and I sort of kind of had to pluck up the courage and try and think of the words. And I said to her, well, you know, why did you do it? I didn't even know what it really was actually at the time. And she said, well, I just read about it in a magazine. So then I went to the surgeon and I said, what is it? You know, and he's like, oh, well, women come in and they say, you know, make me 16 again. Or actually they would often come in with literally a picture from a porn magazine, a double-page spread, and they would say, I want to look like this. And so he would do sort of surgery on the vagina to aestheticize it, to conform to the porn industry standards of what it should look like. This is during surgery. And this is a woman I met in a beauty convention. Very difficult to tell how old she is. She's got the hands of an much older woman, face of a younger woman. And it's an interesting image for me, this one, because I wanted to pose this question of like, what is okay? What do we want? What do we, you know, what is good? Does she look good for her age? Many people would say yes. At what cost? You know, has she spent all of her life savings to achieve that look? Is she a happier woman for it? These questions are very difficult and they're constantly changing. What we're willing to do to ourselves is changing every day, really. This is a tummy tuck operation, a simple surgical procedure, but I wanted to show the reality of this surgery as well. And this is Miss Essex. At the moment, she realised that she hadn't won the Miss England pageant. Very, very, very unhappy. This is a woman from Britain. She's an anorexic. A difficult shot, a difficult thing to find someone to photograph, and also to make sure they knew the context that the image was going to be used in. I was lucky to find her. She supported the ideas of the project, and was happy to pose as well. Ronnie Coleman, he's the sort of 7-time world bodybuilding champion in this sort of absurd caricature of maleness in a way. This is the office of a plastic surgery magazine in Brazil. Simple picture, but also very revealing. If you look at the images on the wall, you know, there are no black women, there's no dark-haired women. It's like in Brazil, where people are very multiracial and there's a large proportion of the population who are black, they are invisible in the magazines and in advertising and on posters, simply have been erased. This girl at fat camp in America, where American parents send their kids to lose weight. This is Guy Anthony. He's waiting for liposuction. You can see the markings under his chin where they're going to suck out the fat. And I said to him, "Why are you doing this?" He was also having a couple of other little procedures, and he said to me, "I'm competing with men 20 years younger than me at work." And it was quite revealing because, you know, something's happened to our culture where age has been sold to us as a disease that has to be cured or at least hidden. So you can spend a lot of money on doing things to make yourself look younger. And we live in a kind of youth-obsessed society, and you know, people of a certain age would have once commanded respect and, you know, been given a pay rise. Now they're sort of made redundant, and you know, it's like, oh, we'll get someone cheaper and younger. And so there's been this kind of amazing reversal. The beauty industry have played their part in that as well. This is a slightly silly picture of a man with a very hairy back, which I saw in Brazil, and I suddenly realised I didn't see that many hairy people anymore. And then I did some research, and Men's Health magazine in America hasn't had a hairy chest on its cover since 1995. And I thought this was just an extraordinary fact, that in 1995 there was a genetic evolutionary leap where the pelts of men just fell off and we became hairless like women became hairless in 1972. Actually, I think women still had hairy armpits in 1972, but I'm not sure what year it happened, but suddenly everyone's hairless. And it's the same thing is happening to men. Now, if you go to an American high school, men are shaving their chest. Guys on the football team, it's becoming standard, and it's an incredible shift in culture. This is toe surgery, where if you want to wear your little Jimmy Choo pointed shoes, but you have a normal foot, you have to have a portion of the bone cut out. They just chop a centimetre of bone from the middle of your toe and then splint it back together. And this is a facelift. I don't know if anyone's seen the film Brazil. There's a scene that's just like this. I mean, just an extraordinary thing when you see this being done and you realise it really is just, I don't know, like pulling the skin off a chicken and cutting a bit off and then sticking it back down again. So I really enjoyed that one. This is Dr. Pitanguy. He's a plastic surgeon in Brazil who once a month offers free surgery to the poor. He chooses one lucky person to perform a breast implant on or something. And this is the same guy, Ronnie Coleman again, in a way the reality of that amazing physique, half man, half Kentucky Fried Chicken. But the reality is, you know, he's so big and his little heart can't pump enough blood around and his lungs can't sustain that kind of body mass. So while during the performance, during the competition, he has paramedics, you know, backstage. There's nothing more to say from that. This is in Brazil as well, where women are so body obsessed that they carry on having beauty pageants even when they're prisoners in prison. You know, most women at beauty pageants, they say, I want to help little children. And, you know, they say, what do you do? And they say, I'm a model. And in this prison they say, and what are you doing? And they say 17 years for drug dealing. But it's just an amazing scene there. And this is in Senegal in Africa. Again, you know, this is a culture where people are, you know, their natural skin colour is very dark. And yet every single poster and advert and shampoo bottle features a pale-skinned woman with straightened hair, you know, bleached hair as well. And so again, it's the sort of very toxic cultural thing that's happening. This woman is holding a picture of herself when she was using the skin lightening cream, which is widely available. Everyone uses it. Well, not everyone, but it's... I said to people, why would you use this? It's dangerous, it can give you cancer. And she said, because men just ignore us if we're not pale-skinned. So the men have also, or they've been indoctrinated and brainwashed. The women then conform, and it's just a sort of vicious cycle. In China, people have nose jobs, but they actually put a piece in the nose instead of removing nose bone to have a more of a Western nose. And again, this is the sort of darkness of it all, is that if you sell this idea of a Western ideal, people all over the globe spend money and time and energy in trying to look more European and trying to conform to this ideal. And that was the sort of really driving force of the book. This is a portrait of Jane, the British woman who went to Malaysia to have her stomach cut off. She was that extraordinary picture of the tummy tuck operation. So they literally just hacked off the fat of her stomach and then sewed her back up. And she went to Malaysia because it's cut price, it's half the price of doing it in England. And also you go there and you pretend you haven't had it done. You know, you come back and everyone says, oh my God, you look great. And then you're like, oh yeah, 2 weeks by the pool, you know, I lost a bit of weight. And you recuperate there and you sort of hobble around for 2 weeks. This sort of, how do they call it, safari surgery or something. So that's lovely. So that was that book. And this is a poem by Raymond Carver. And it really just talks about how, and the name of the book is lovely, it really encapsulates this idea that ultimately as humans we really just want to be loved and noticed and fancied and all sorts of things. But the beauty industry have convinced us in order to be loved or to be lovable we have to have little noses and no hair and, you know, pale skin and blonde hair. And it's just this idea that if you can subvert this idea of what is natural with something that's artificial, then you can make money from it. So it's often it's just about raw commercialism. So that was that book. And then finally, after doing that, you know, I sort of thought, oh God, I need to do something pleasant. You know, I don't want to be in that world anymore. So I decided to do something very local. I live in Hackney in London. And I decided to just kind of wander the streets and take pictures and try and remember what it is to take a photograph without, you know, tying yourself down with too much politics and anxiety about what you're doing. So I began this sort of series of portraits, initially looking at kind of street culture and fashion, and then it broadened out into a look at this area that was really undergoing quite rapid change and gentrification. It had gone from quite a poor area to quite a trendy area, and then from trendy it was also becoming wealthy. There was like house prices had sort of gone off the scale, wealthy people were moving in, the place was changing. And what interested me were these two very different economic kind of worlds inhabiting the same place. Sort of quite disadvantaged people mixing with kind of very advantaged. So the project became sort of touching on some of those issues. But essentially it was quite a simple sort of way of sort of looking at my own doorstep and looking at the kind of ugliness and the beauty of the place as well. And so I just, I sort of began to just wander the streets, and it's just a way of kind of allowing myself to get back in touch with not getting on an aeroplane and sort of trying to do anything too ambitious for a while. I was interested in Hackney as well. It's always sort of like it's trying to be reclaimed by nature all the time. It doesn't matter how much they do to it, things seem to just crack and fall apart, and I quite like that about the place. I mean, even that car has a flat tyre at the front of it. It's just sort of... and what this next shot, this girl had been shot in the neck in this chicken shop as well. And it was just literally on the next corner from where I was doing the sort of hipstery portraits. And so, this was really got me thinking about how these two worlds can coexist in the same place and become kind of almost invisible to each other. And since then I've been doing more projects about wealth disparity and property prices, and looking at things that really feel like they underpin our time. There's a little trendy cafe down the road. And these odd little sort of yuppie houses which sprout up, they're like little mushrooms, and they suddenly appear from nowhere. And these are like members of this little gang in London Fields, but the houses behind them are now worth millions, and it's such a sort of strange moment in this sort of transition of this place. This is sort of like a little fashion shoot. And then this is the finale of gentrification. Once you see the trees wrapped up in knitted jumpers, your area has now been fully gentrified, and that every coffee will cost £3.50 from now on, which is what has happened in Hackney. And if we've got time, I'm going to show like just 3-minute film. I've got a clip that's 3 minutes and 2 minutes. Have we got time? I just threw these in as a way of sort of reminding myself and you that I have to earn money as well as I go along doing these projects. And so, I went to South Sudan a couple of years ago. They gained independence, and I was very interested in doing a much more positive story about an African country that had, after years of war, had suddenly become independent and was recreating itself. So I did a story there about that. I've got this sort of ongoing project about British ways of life that are disappearing. I tend to do portraits every now and again for magazines, which are just quite nice, interesting things to do. You get very limited time with someone, but they're a kind of way of, these long-term projects are brilliant, but that you can go a little bit insane while you're doing them, so you need to kind of have other things that kind of ground you and give you either little bits of money or just experiences that are different. Then I made a film, this was a few years ago in Texas, where I'd gone there and I realised that Texas wasn't the place that I thought it was, which was just the sort of gentle rolling hills and cows and cowboys. That it was actually a vastly polluted, horrible place where they built some of the biggest oil refineries in the world next to African American neighbourhoods, poor neighbourhoods. There was no pollution controls. The death penalty was #1 in America. Everything was bad. George Bush, you know, the former president, had been the governor of Texas. So I ended up making a documentary film about that. And I was totally inexperienced. You know, I'd never made a film. I didn't know what I was doing. So it was a kind of huge learning curve. So I made that. I'm not going to show you that one. It's actually on my website if anyone's interested in seeing more film work. So I'm just going to show you now 2 super short clips of 2 short films that I made for Channel 4 recently. One was about UKIP, the political party, and it was during the election when UKIP were getting quite a lot of support, and they said, Channel 4 was like, do you want to make a little film about UKIP? And I said, yeah, maybe. Am I allowed to take the piss a little bit? And they said, yeah, you can definitely do what you want. So I just went to the UKIP convention, the political convention, and made a film in sort of 2 days. So I'll just show you that, and it's got a little interview. And I framed it and lit it almost like a still photograph of some of the interviews. So I'll show you that, if we can find it.
It's a Marmite issue, UKIP. Some people are like, yeah, UKIP. You know, you get quite a lot of that, even in classes, like, yeah, UKIP, when we're discussing immigration or something, in geography. And then you get a lot of people that go, UKIP, racist bastards and things like that. You know, they really hate us. It's very much Marmite.
I can't believe that the Conservatives have done what they've done. I mean, I am beside myself with concern.
There's a small element of anarchism in that, I suppose, yeah. But it's certainly a group of individuals who firmly believe in their country, have been let down by the other parties, and actually are beginning to certainly find their own voice.
So I helped to raise funds for UKIP and itself, and along with a team of other ladies, by running a raffle table and selling the fruitcake.
So that's all there is of that one, unfortunately. But it's on my website. It's 11 minutes long, the whole film. It's quite amusing because they're quite amusing. And I'll just show you one more bit, which is from another short film, again for Channel 4. The other amazing thing is that they commissioned them and they showed it on the news, on Channel 4 News, between the 7 and 8 o'clock slot. So it was extraordinary that they did it. And like a couple of the films have even got me burbling in the background, you know, asking stupid questions. And during the interviews, one of the UKIP people says something racist, and then he sort of says, oh, no, I didn't mean that. And I left all of that in. And it was amazing seeing it on the news in all its ramshackle glory. So I quite enjoyed doing it. So then they asked me to do one about gaming, about, you know, young people and gaming, about how there was something in the news about how much screen time is good for people, and they were like, we don't know what to do, can you make a film about gaming? And I was like, I don't really know anything about it. So I went to a gaming convention just because it was a way of sort of doing something quickly and finding people, and so I think that was like a 9-minute film. So I'll just show you a clip of that as well. How do we get it to full size again?
And here we are at an event that will see 40,000 people through the doors over the weekend to share a belief in gaming, a sense of belonging.
We were here till 4 o'clock this morning, gaming, and we headed home, got up this morning, had a quick shower, a wee bite to eat, and back out again. As long as he's not feeling tired or anything like that, he's excited.
My favourite game is Black Ops 2, but when Black Ops 3 comes out, it will definitely be that because it looks so good.
The
when people first come to Insomnia and they don't know what to expect, and I'm pretty sure quite a few expect to see a load of teenagers hunched in anoraks over flickering CRT screens, never having seen daylight before, but it really couldn't be further from the truth.
Once you sort of adopt that avatar that you're playing, you can be anything and anyone. My costume's inspired by Renoa from one of the Final Fantasy games.
I've designed this based on Arkham Asylum, the video game version.
I'm dressed as the Penguin for the movie Batman Returns.
It's not your own life, like your life could suck, but you're this amazing character. It's given me a lot of confidence because I've found characters I want to dress up as. I feel strong and everything else. I feel like I'm them.
The game has saved my life. If it wasn't for that, I don't think I would be able to deal with the situation I'm in. I hit a rabbit on my motorbike at 95 miles an hour. I was driving a Yamaha YZF R125, and this caused me to be paralysed. I was a very physical, active person before my crash, so if there's any games like on Grand Theft Auto, when I play that, I just drive around on the motorbike the whole time. Like first person view on the motorbike, driving around, swerving in and out of traffic, just doing silly things. Because it reminds me of my past, I could still live that past, so at this time I won't die.
So yeah, that's that. So yeah, that little film, you know, and then it went on to look at addiction and how people spent like absolutely hours and hours a day playing it. And again, it was quite nice because when they put it out there, it wasn't disapproving or you know, it didn't fall into an obvious format of trying to say it's right or wrong. It just ended up all these people, you know, sort of slightly addicted, but you know, wanting to be in a group and in a gang and looking for identity. So it's quite an interesting kind of package in the end, and they didn't force me to oversimplify it. So yeah, I think that's probably it, isn't it, for timing wise now? We'll go on forever, but thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Right, we're going to take a short break. It's 1:15, so
I think I've discovered, post the last, I'm not going to say how many years, doing American culture, that I'm actually motivated by subject matter that is legal but not socially acceptable. And that's taken me quite a few years to work out. What are you motivated by?
Do you mean socially accepted or acceptable?
No, not socially accepted.
Right, yeah.
Can I pick, sorry, can I just butt in? Well, go
Yeah.
That's a subject matter that you're interested in. But I suppose what I might be interested in, and what's the motivation kind of beyond? What do you want the work to achieve?
No, I think I pick subjects that are quite non-PC. In retrospect, when I look back, they are legal maybe. It's certainly the prostitution that I followed. I didn't want to go into dark streets or, you know, where it was all, yeah. I just preferred to be out and open, and it was like the complete opposite of what you would perceive prostitution to look like. It was in wide open skies in the middle of the desert. It was quite glamorous. It was in Nevada, but it not necessarily, still not socially accepted. It's kind of non-PC. So there's a kind of,
So do you want the work to achieve a broader debate?
No, I think I want to
make
show.
it more acceptable.
Yes, I want
highlight.
to debate about something that you would have preconceptions about, and I enjoy showing the other side of things. I think so that people don't, so that it opens their horizons, so they see it in a different way.
You're advertising prostitution. Well, no, in a way though, you are showing a role model of how it can sort of work well. But you know that the first bit with the pimps,
Yeah.
But that felt very different, because also I thought it sort of glamorised that slightly dubious, you know, like they're all like, oh, we're the pimps.
But it does glamorise
You know what I mean?
it. That was kind of the point.
Mm.
It's the fact that, and that pimp convention is extraordinary. And I mean, it's in Chicago, and it's extraordinary. And we were the only white people there, and it was like, it was a world. It was a subculture, and it was a world completely by itself. So it's other worlds that you fight to have access to, and then you can show other people the other worlds that they'll never get to see.
But did you feel that it was like your duty to be critical of it, or was it, because I haven't seen that whole film,
No,
so
no.
I'm only going on that clip, whereas the Bunny Ranch thing seems the women are more, kind of, they look like they're more in control. And
felt safer. Like
Yeah.
the pimp convention felt like a place you didn't want to be. Felt quite like I imagine it was a pretty scary place to be. Whereas the other ones felt.
It's completely out of my comfort zone, that's for sure. But absolutely fascinating at the same time. And to me, documentary photography for me and the subjects that I follow is always a privilege. So I felt terribly privileged to be in that scenario, no matter what it meant or what it said. It was a privilege that I saw and experienced and was able to document something.
But do you ever feel compromised by it? You know, if you're there and something's happening and you sort of think, I sometimes think, I don't like this, you know, but so is it a duty to therefore criticise it in some way or not?
I feel that I'm showing it as it is, and it's up to the viewer to criticise it and make their own judgments from it. But I mean, I'm sure we've all been in scenarios where we've witnessed something that we felt we shouldn't be witnessing, and that's really difficult.
I felt for both of you actually was does it, when you're that sort of far embedded in something, does it become less weird or more weird when you're, do you know what I mean? Like if I went to one of those places as an outsider, it would be like going to a foreign country and everything would seem quite weird, but if you're there, does it become the normal, or does it?
I think you get used to things quite quickly.
I think the armour gets thicker, and you do hide behind the camera, which we discussed. You know, that is part of the armour that you have, and you're looking through there, which takes away the fact, well, I think it half takes away the fact that you're actually there in the room, sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, when I did Gun Nation, I would always go for reasonably short trips, because after 2 weeks, everything ceases to be shocking. So I wanted to feel slightly shocked, so I'd go there, leave, go back. So you'd always have that kind of slightly amazed.
Because once you go into other worlds, and it is that, you know, whether it's a gun world or whatever other world you go into, it does become the norm. And you do start to normalise it, I think, because it is you become part of their world. And it is to maintain the objective is that, you know, certain people, for instance, American culture, a lot of Americans criticise me for kind of dipping into their life, you know, because it's, well, what do you know? You don't live here, so therefore. But I actually see the reverse. I think it's much better that you don't live there and you have a better perspective, like most things, like most problems that you have yourself, you don't realise and it takes someone else from outside to tell you about it. So that is a very important part, I think, of going into somebody else's culture and showing a different perspective, I think.
As long as they don't come and do the same to us.
But they do.
I think to answer your question, my reasons probably are more obvious because I've talked about them, but they are generally driven by wanting to explore something. I mean, often I choose things as well because I genuinely want to know more about them myself rather than starting off as a sort of point of an expert. But they are often driven by something that doesn't feel right. You know, Gun Nation is obvious, there's just a sheer number of deaths. Why is it accepted as being normal? So it's not just trying to stop deaths, but it's also trying to explore psychologically how something so extreme can be repackaged in our minds as being normal. And with Love Me it was the same. It was like how insidious this kind of industry is and how it's affected us, but how we don't know, we no longer realise it's happening to us. But it is making us insecure and self-aware and hyper kind of, just bringing up very strange feelings in us as humans. So there is a point to almost deconstruct it or sort of prick the bubble and see the obvious that's all around us. So that's a motivating factor with that. Whereas the Hackney one was more of a personal kind of meandering journey to, that was the first time I thought, I'm not going to give myself a brief, really kind of complicated end game. This will just be a small journey. Whereas the others, I think I had much more of a sort of point from the beginning.
I suppose my motivations are a lot different. They're a bit more abstract and probably a bit more selfish. I don't work well in big projects, so I don't sort of embed myself in situations and kind of dip my toe in. And I think the only kind of unifying quality of my work is it's about myself. So I know I've always been kind of like pursuing this idea of like sort of abstract other worlds behind. So I kind of, all my subject matter kind of blurs and blends into one thing, and I don't tend to make pictures for like, I have a motivation to kind of get a message across. I make pictures to make kind of strange and beautiful and scary images that are maybe more descriptive about my life than they are about anyone else's. It's kind of a hard thing to put into words, and I've got a whole project that's pictures that are just that, which came from various documentary projects and even some commissions. So it's a hard abstract concept to put into words, but yeah, they're not so kind of, I made it to put this message across.
Do you prefer subject matter that's closer to home, or that's, and the physicality of? So it takes me like a long haul flight to go outside, whereas you seem to go. You're more interested in like people in the British culture.
Yeah, I've always tried to make work about what I know. I think it's kind of, for me, it's more challenging to try and make what's around me interesting rather than to go somewhere else and make something that's sort of weirdly sort of on the opposite end of to what you do. But yeah, I think to kind of, it's always a nice experience to go somewhere else and make work, because it's your focus is just on making work and there's inspiration everywhere. But what's interesting for me is trying to find inspiration within my world.
It's interesting how with a number of your projects, Zed, you're looking like the beauty project. You're looking at how it's affecting Brazil and various other countries all around. Whereas like I think like with your projects that are more local and it's more more British based. It's interesting in that how do we perceive ourselves? Like you said, well, we don't want them coming over and doing it to us.
That was a joke.
Yeah, no, but there was an element of truth to it in the fact that can we do it to ourselves? Can we try and stand back from what is us and try and see it as an outsider, which is incredibly difficult to do. But there are very strange things that we do that are happening on our doorsteps, that are happening in our own towns. And I just wondered, in your case, when you did Hackney, was there, if you thought about finding a subject that you find as controversial abroad happening that's strictly British?
Yeah, but even Love Me is about us. It's about what we do, because whereas before I might have been, go to Somalia and see what they do. Look, they're all killing each other over there, and then it was like, oh no, actually they're killing each other, but they're using our guns. And their president of their company is a puppet of our governments that has been artificially kept in power there. So already it's like withdrawing from that idea. And then the Gun Nation was about, okay, let's look at where the guns come from. And then Love Me is, where does the ideal come from? It comes from the West and colonialism. So even though it's about, it might have been shot in 17 different countries, it's already kind of holding a mirror up to.
So you're looking at all the kind of fingers of Western influence going through all these different areas
in that
across the globe. With both projects, really, aren't you? Because you're like our the guns and the beauty is all coming from our culture, really.
Yeah. Well, the gun thing was looking at the source of it, and Love Me is looking at the kind of philosophy and the social kind of beginnings of it. But you know, it wasn't about Brazil or about this. It was just about humans and how, again, though, it was about industry. It was about how the beauty industry have worked on us. So I suppose if I look for a theme, it's about that sort of commercialism and how we are tricked into doing things. The Guns is the same. It's all about selling weapons. So yeah, and then Hackney is obviously much more closer to home. But that was more like just a sort of antidote to everything that had gone. But then since then I've done, you know, stuff about Tower Hamlets, wealth disparity there, about property prices, and then the stuff for Channel 4 about UKIP and the gaming convention. So actually it started off, that doing Hackney has allowed me to now really focus on Britain, which I hadn't done previously. And you're right, in a way it is harder. It's much easier to sort of see something exotic and far away. And there's a time and a place, and you know, sometimes you think, oh, I've done that, I'm going to do this. And so I'm having an England moment.
It's really interesting the way that the two of you said that, like, you know, you like to go away from it, so that when you go back you have the shock of it again, whereas you're talking about you really like going back again and again and getting embedded. So that's very different. Because I always think, you know, with documentary stuff that you get, you know, work that you go there and you get to know everybody, you get embedded, and the longer you go on, the more you get out of it. It's interesting to think of it the way that you're thinking of it.
There's different ways of working, aren't there?
It's just different.
There is no right way. If anyone has questions, just put your hand up. And otherwise, we're just going to go and run out of time. Do you want to?
Yeah. With your Hackney project, I noticed there was a bit of a almost stylistic change. Was that like a purposeful thing because it was such like a more personal thing? It seems more like each shot seems more staged and like more not staged but more like considered and less reportage and more sort of like flat sort of documentary as you see it in sort of American artists a lot.
Yeah. So what's the question? Like, did I consciously
change your style for it because it seems less reportage to me?
Yeah, I mean, not really consciously, but I think just each project has its own kind of language that changes a little bit. Like Gun Nation had a sort of mixed visual language because I wanted to sort of jar people by juxtaposing one type of image with another that then made you read both images differently. Love Me was more complicated because it was so global. It was really difficult to build a cohesive picture, a set of work that you could edit together easily. But then I've done other things. I did something in North Wales and I shot it much sort of, in a way, more mundanely, you know, sort of tonally, they were more sort of neutral. And I started thinking, my God, I'm getting more and more mundane. Like, if I look at my early work, it was more sensational and sort of urgent and, in a way, I hate to say it, but more interesting because the pictures were sort of more typically photographic. And over the years, you know, I kind of attracted to a simpler, more sort of straight way of doing it. So it's kind of always changing, but I do think each project has its own way, you know, you choose a way. And I think with Hackney, it was all shot on film using a medium format camera, not in a rush, more considered, and so that just takes you in a slight route, you know. I mean, do you change as you go, or do you feel you've got a great, amazing kind of thread running through the...
Yeah, I suppose I do respond to the project, like you say, you respond visually to, so, I mean, these were examples where people were coming to me with an idea, so I'd generally look at that and then think, well, how do I want to make it? And so sometimes 5:4 is the best way to do it, but sometimes it's the worst thing to do because it is so slow. And I was going to ask you, what do you wear, like kind of different hats when you're shooting the more sort of photojournalistic, reportage looking stuff that's in Love Me compared to the studio stuff? Is there a whole different feeling when you're making it?
No, not really. I mean, I think it's just happens that way, you know. I mean, there's not that much reportage in Love Me, but there's some bit, you know, like the beauty queen at the Miss Essex, you know, when she was crying. That, in a way, I sort of felt like that didn't even fit. But then it really injected a bit of something in the project. If it's all stripped down and all kind of calm, it can go too far. And I remember taking that picture, and it was also the only picture that was lit with flash. And it was also the only picture that I felt morally awkward about taking, because she was so upset. And I looked at her, I identified her across the room, and I thought, I want that in the book, because, you know, but I knew it was a horrible thing to do in some way. And it was too dark, it was in this really dark room, and I had to put the flash on, and like, you know, set it all up, pre-focus, and walk towards her. And a little part of me died inside. I don't photograph people in that way. I tend to be very sort of slow and talk to people and everything. But I just thought, I'm just going to literally take this picture. Because I just went and sort of napalmed her with flash. And she was crying out from the sky. I mean, she was like hysterical. And, you know, I didn't like doing it, but I weighed up, you know, what I wanted compared. And I thought, she's competing, she's in public, she's put herself out there. And I knew she didn't want to be remembered in that moment. So the style was forced upon me just because I couldn't have shot it any differently. So it tends to, if I shoot something like that, it's because I just had to, you know.
Can I, because you led me to a place that I wanted to ask about earlier, which is the idea about your relationship to your subjects. Because we've heard a lot about attitudes to subjects, whether it's kind of one of benevolence or one of kind of social critique. But I'm interested in what your relationship is and how integral you think the subject's willingness to be photographed is to the audience understanding of the stories you're trying to tell.
Willingness,
well,
they...
Yeah, I mean, whether or not they are. Because how we make meaning from the pictures is kind of dealing with that surface, isn't it? What we see on the screen, what we see in the book. And we're sitting here listening to you talk about your motivations, about your stories, about making the work. We're not hearing anything from the subject about what their motivations were for being part and parcel of those projects. I'm interested in what your relationship is with them then, in that kind of construction of the image. How you feel about
I
them.
had one girl talking about their motivations in Precious, because obviously I had to ask the women, and obviously everyone's complicit to that, because you can tell, because obviously it takes a long time to take one of those pictures. And one woman really wanted to do it, but she had an issue with it, and she didn't want to be naked, which is another really weird thing. You would have thought if you're photographing prostitutes, it was easy to take their clothes off. It wasn't easy for them at all. They, like everyone else, has issues about their bodies, you know, and that whole thing. But she decided, she came back to me 3 days later and said, I've decided I really, really want to do this, but you're going to have to help me with this, because no one's ever photographed me naked before. And she said, I'm paranoid about my arms. This is a very sad story, actually. And her arms had kind of, when she was fostered, she'd been locked up in a cupboard until she was like 10 or 12, when the parents went out. And she had her arms behind her back so that she didn't move. And so she grew up without any muscles in her upper arms. And it was such a tragic story. I was just blown away by it. And she said, would you help me? I'm trying to kind of get over this issue and feel more confident about the way I look. So we spent, 2 or 3 hours, and it was part of therapy for her. And that's when you feel like you're actually giving back, because half of it is always you're feeling like you're taking it away from them. But in actual fact, this was a kind of mutual accepted, and that's how she felt. And she felt after she got this photograph done that she had achieved something quite major.
That's probably a better way of putting it. So do you see what you do as taking portrait pictures, or do you see it as making them together with the subject? Is it a collaborative process, or is it?
I wish it was the latter for me, but I think for me, I don't know about yourself, but it's so often the case is I have such a limited time with people, so you don't get time. When it's kind of, if you're spending a day with someone, then it's a lot easier to foster a relationship and work on an image with them, but quite often you just not got the time. So it does feel like you're stealing from people just as much, I think, as like if I've got someone in front of the background and it's lit, just as much as you going up to that girl and peppering her with flash. I don't think there's any kind of real, unless it is a truly collaborative experience like you have,
Yeah.
then I don't think there is any real separation between scanning an image of someone that's unaware and putting someone who's probably just as unaware in front of your camera.
Yeah, we'll do questions in a second. For me, it's just, it can completely change from being absolutely like with the anorexia woman, you know, working with her, so she knew exactly what I was doing and why, and making sure she was happy with the message. Whereas one of the plastic surgeons, I might be doing the opposite, denying what the message really is and tricking them into posing because I just want them in the picture as a representative of something I don't like. So it can be both extremes really, and everything in between. And I think, but even, you know, a simple portrait of a young person, you're using them in a way, but people have complex reasons for wanting to be photographed, and I'm always amazed that people agree. And it's the same, this idea of love, you know, love me. We're all sort of desperately wanting to be noticed in the world. So it's complex about why people agree and what they get out of it as well. So I don't think you should necessarily have complete guilt about just because you're collaborating.
And I do think when you have a greater experience with someone where you experience more of a connection with them, it does usually result in a more soulful looking portrait.
It does. Can I ask both of you a question? Have you ever not taken a picture because you think it's morally wrong?
Yeah.
Yeah, what have you not taken?
Can't remember. Loads of things, I think. Loads of times.
I'm never really in that situation. I've never really been in that situation where I've had to make a decision like that, because it's not really sort of my area.
I talk people out of pictures. I talk them into it, and then they agree, and then I think, you shouldn't be doing this. Like that, you know, then I'll say to them, I don't think you should do this. Have you thought about what this is going to mean when it comes out in the magazine? So, I think we just worry we should do questions, otherwise people are going to go home. Yeah, you had a question.
Yeah. I just had a question that's slightly linked to what Paul was asking, which was in the gun donation. I'm interested in the sort of practicality. Did you have to say to them where you're going to show these pictures, what they were for? And did you have to get model release forms signed by them?
I did get consent forms for some of the portraits. I mean, everyone's obsessed about them, and you don't have to have them if they're in a public place. But it is useful to have it. In fact, that guy, the guy holding the baby, that was going to be on the cover of Time magazine, and they needed a consent form for that to be on the cover because it's seen as an advert for the magazine, and I didn't have one for him, so they pulled it, which was crushing, you know. So ever since then, I thought I'm going to try and get consent forms for everything, but they didn't need it for inside the magazine. What was the other question?
Well, it was just. Particularly in that one, you obviously you said you were in the shop for quite a while, and people became relaxed and happy. Did they ever say, where is it
about how much you tell people? One of the joys of humans is that they never really ask you any questions. And so if you're doing something that they're not going to like, you never ever have to lie because they just don't ever ask. So I would benefit from that. And I would say, I don't lie, but I would say it's a story looking at American gun culture. And then I'd say, we're not allowed guns in England, and they'd go, oh my God, you're not allowed guns? Really? And, you know, you'd be like, and they would treat you with pity rather than feeling something else. And the same with plastic surgeons, you know, often they're just salesmen trying to ply their wares, so they would sort of think that this is good publicity for them. So with the anorexia, I went to great pains to explain what it was, because I didn't want her to be used wrongly, but with other people you just think and just tell you what you need to know, and then they didn't ask anything else, you know, so just sort of use the truth sparingly at times. But again, it's a value judgment on every shoot whether you think it's fair or not. And with younger people you have to be more careful, and, you know, with the under-16s disco, then that presented very different kind of awkward issues. One of the parents wrote to me and she's like, Katie was very excited to be in the book. We were a little bit freaked out by the context of the book, but she's so happy to be in it, you know, so those are the things I worried about, you know. So you have to make your own little rules as you go along. Yeah.
All of your projects in the world are very powerful. And has attended higher education as well. I'm speaking specifically of the Lovely project. do you think it's always seen by the audience that it could be most educational for, and do you have power to put it into those contexts?
Yeah, no, when it's been exhibited, it's gone down well with, you know, young people, and schools have come around, and that's always generated quite good responses. And I get little messages saying, oh, you know, we've really adopted that as a topic, and it really brought people out talking about things. It seems to work really well with young, sort of pre-college people in that way. So it's, you know, it's quite good.
It goes down to schools.
It doesn't really go to schools, but if you have an exhibition, the schools go to it. You know, and so in that way it's quite good. Totally sure I got the question, but have you got a handle on it?
If you mean, by having a camera gives you better access to
visual culture.
The visual culture,
how
yes.
people read into a photograph. And is that more accessible to what you're talking about?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, all I know is that I can never get stuff published in America. Love Me, it never got published as a project, ever, in any American magazine, and it's been published in like 18 magazines around the world. So I'm not really an expert on it, because they won't publish the work, so maybe that somehow answers it. I don't know.
But that,
you have any views on it?
psychology.
Quite understand. Do you think, I mean, like, do you think there is?
I don't know. I think it's a new language, definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, you sort of hear lots of political debates about image, body image, for example. But then you go through all sorts of different media platforms online, and there you see people, you know, with selfies, sort of consciously free.
Yeah, it's hard. I can't.
A photograph can be a universal tool to talk about a subject matter that we all think is sort of innate to our own culture. And are we so dissimilar? You know, sort of guns are prohibited here, but we have a rise in knife crime. How is that viewed elsewhere?
Yeah, no, they definitely see things differently and reinterpret images differently, but it's all more to do with the politics of an image than a visual thing, I think. You know, the Mike and the baby, they see that as, if you're pro-gun, they see it as a symbol of strength and protection. They don't, and then the English person will see it as an appalling, you know, proximity of a gun and a baby. Oh, it's horrible. And so that was really interesting to see how one image can be utterly read differently. But it's not so much because one's in England and one's in America, it's more, and in fact, I saw the same picture cut out of the magazine and stuck on banners at an anti-gun protest, waved around at Columbine, blown up by American sort of liberal anti-gun people. But then Mike wrote to me and said, oh, can I have a signed print of the picture? And he saw it as a symbol of, you know, freedom and everything. So I don't think you can say, oh, Americans do this or do that. It's just they've got their political views and their backgrounds and their aesthetic education, and they read things very differently. So, yeah, it's a tough one.
Can I just add something to that, if it's all right? In this room, I asked a very similar question to Mitch Epstein when he came in to talk some time ago. And he, not that he didn't understand the question, but he really struggled with the question. And we had kind of a little conversation about that. And I think there is a different reading within American culture, also American educational system, the way that they decode photography and imagery, and it's quite subtle. And I asked a very similar question about how, you know, about American imperialism, and I think that when you live in America, you don't necessarily think about American imperialism, because a lot of Americans see America as America, and they don't necessarily consider the rest of the world in the way that maybe Europeans do.
Well, I think that's true. Yeah. I mean, but what, if you were going to go further, what do you mean? Do you mean that they just have a sort of more insular view of questioning?
Actually, when I was asking about the metaphor of the American flag in some of his images, in particular the work that he did of his father's business after, you know, in family business, and how, you know, an American flag that was disintegrating. Has that becoming a metaphor for the changes in America post 9/11? And I thought that was just a reasonably straightforward question, and he clearly hadn't thought of it in world terms. and I thought more just very much about his family and that particular town, which I thought was quite interesting. As a very intelligent man, and one of my, I have to say, I was devastated because he's one of my hero photographers, and I think he thought I was just being smart ass.
Why were you devastated by the lack of?
No, that's what he clearly thought I was being smart.
Oh, I see. Yeah. I know what you mean. He'd fallen from grace in your eyes because he hadn't.
No.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think you are right. Yeah. This is turning into a debate on America, isn't it? Americana based.
Question. Take it away from America, even though we sort of introduced it. Sorry. This one's for Spencer. The work you mentioned earlier on was based on Nietzsche, right?
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. So I was going to ask, basically, with those sort of large philosophical concepts, people like him, do you find it easier to pull documentary work, or not necessarily? It's difficult giving it a genre title, but to pull work together with those more complex philosophical thoughts than it is to do it with a very human way? Because Jane and Zed both mentioned they found it difficult sometimes personally photographing other cultures, even if it's America and you speak the same language. You still have you feel you have a certain responsibility. Do you feel that with a more abstract thesis, it's easier for you to create a body of work?
It was more a reaction to how I work. So I had a lot of projects at that point where I decided to make the work's called The Abyss Gazes Into You. So the work came from, say, a decade of working as a photographer, and I tend to flip between projects. So I had projects where there were probably 20 pictures, but I only liked one or two of them, and they said something differently, and then I found if I put them with something from a totally different project or some of my personal work, and they started to read off of one another, it kind of subverted the meaning, and it was more about me and how I saw the world. So it was more an excuse to do something than it was like that I had that idea of the world and then made the work. It was something that was always kind of in me, and I was always making pictures about, but I didn't necessarily know it. And then I decided to kind of get rid of all the stuff that I thought was superfluous and put everything together.
Yeah.
But I still tend to make little documentary projects about the subject, and the philosophy and stuff comes afterwards, I suppose. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. Do American people find that upsetting for you to challenge your freedom? And with Jane's work, Jane tends to look at quieter, and she's looked at, with the stuff with the cowboys, it's more romanticised in a way. I just wanted to...
Yeah, it's gentler, isn't it, and more romantic. Maybe I'm looking at a negative, and you're looking at, in a way, at positive.
Yeah,
in some ways.
I would say that.
So, and I'm not sort of anti-American at all. And things that interest me is that I look for the things that are wrong in me as well, that are reflected, often magnified by America. So, guns, for instance. I'm not unaware that as a little boy I was obsessed by guns and watched war films and cowboy films. And so I'm often, and I wanted, even in the project, to recognise the seductiveness of guns. I didn't want them to be, oh, they're really bad. It accepts that they're attractive, that people misuse them because they're amazing objects to fire. So, and the same with Love Me, it's kind of this idea that we see ourselves in it, reflected in different ways. And America, I used to maybe be more obsessed by just America as a place, partly because it's like this canvas where everything is played out in a more extreme way.
But it is totally extreme. It's only in America you see certain things, and they are quite unbelievable at times. And it is also the American dream, which is what they kind of rule their lives by. And I think my work's definitely about the American dream and how it plays out, or not, in the case of guns. But, it's cultural, yeah. And I suppose in a way mine's more about the people, I think, in a way.
So in the way they both relate to the concept of American freedom, like the Great West, the cowboy is the epitome of American freedom and American independence, whereas obviously Zed stuff, you could say that it deals more with the fallout rather than positives.
It's also just about psychology, isn't it? It's about like a petri dish, isn't it? What happens if you allow people to do this? If you allow everyone to have a gun, what happens? And then it becomes an interesting psychological investigation. You know what I mean? And the beauty thing is not really about America, but you could say it channels back to like that first image of the little girl. She was an American.
Yeah,
and I was quite careful actually not to shoot too much in America, so people didn't see it as a story, oh, that's what they do in America. But it kind of like...
that would have been easier to do.
I would have been much
to be
easier, yeah,
honest.
but it would have also been easier
Yeah.
to just write off as
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, you know, they're crazy. And then I ended up shooting more and more in England, and then I remember being at a party in Essex and quizzing every woman at the party if she'd had a breast operation. And it was like 40% of people had had a boob job, you know, and I was like, okay, something weird's going on. This is not about America anymore, this is global, you know, this is infiltrating our society.
Exporting their culture all across the globe.
Yeah, in a weird way, I'm doing less and less about America, including it in the package, whereas, you know, but it's a sort of interesting place.
Well, I was going to say, I found out another theory about that essentially British people are lazy and it's a big country that speak the same language as well, which kind of helps with the interest, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely that. I mean, we're all still colonialists in our own little world. But also, I mean, America actually is a colony of Britain. You know, it was, and English people went there, and then it was like it is like a petri dish, like, here, you can go over here, and then kill everyone, and then do what you want. And then what happens? So there is a genuine interest, I think, a lasting interest, because, you know, historically, there's a genuine link, and you know, humans are interested in links. Or we do the opposite, and we just look at foreignness, you know, like, and then, you know, world press photo, foreign people cutting each other's heads off, and you know, then you're like, oh, horrible. And so there's those two extremes. So I'm trying to personally just avoid the extremes and look at the middle ground and how it all crosses over, and looking for the links
Are you
between
both interested in still pursuing the American culture? Because obviously American culture is important. So though I was saying it's spreading over the globe, globally people are starting to think American importance in the world is diminishing. So and they're struggling with that, aren't they? They're really not happy about the thought of them slipping down the scale. Is there anything? Have you got other projects that you're willing to talk about?
No, if Trump wins, if Donald Trump wins, I'm never going to go there ever again.
You won't be allowed.
I don't think you might.
So, Spencer Murphy, National Portrait Gallery Taylor Westing winner 2013. I entered that year, you swine. He has shot for The Guardian Weekend, Telegraph magazine, Time, Monocle, Wallpaper, Rolling Stone magazine, GQ, Dazed and Confused. The list just goes on and on. And his work's been exhibited all over Europe and North America. It doesn't get better than that, really. Okay, so give me the microphone.
Okay, so I suppose when I saw the subject of today's talk, and I saw that I was speaking with Zed and Jane, I was sort of concerned, like, what do I add? There is something that unifies them, and not what I expected when they sort of said the subject was documentary photography. I thought, well, it'd be my personal projects, but they're all commissions. They're all studio portraits, so to some degree staged. 2 of the 3 of them are working with charities. So yeah, there's common themes and sort of not necessarily what I defined as documentary photography. So the first project was working with a charity, and an agency approached my agent on behalf of that charity. The charity is called they were called the Healing Foundation at the time, but they've kind of undergone a rebrand, and they're called the Scar Free Foundation. So they came to me with an idea. My agent was involved in that process, and I kind of, and again, sort of the commonality with all the projects was that I had some amount of creative freedom, which in my editorial work and in my personal work is kind of always the case, but with a lot of stuff where agencies are involved, you're often kind of given the idea to turn into an image, and quite often you're given a drawing of the idea to turn into the image. But these are all exceptions to that rule, and so they came to me with the loose idea that they were going to change the name to the Scar-Free Foundation, and they had the idea that we'd do the ambassadors, which were people who, the sufferers of disfigurement, the doctors, the relations. But I kind of, because it was unpaid and because I had a bit more creative freedom, I kind of said, well, you know, if we concentrate on the doctors and the family members, I think it's just kind of the idea is going to get lost. So we concentrated just on the people who kind of had the injuries. And I suppose what I wanted to do was, I didn't, although I've chosen to do it in a studio environment against a flat background, I didn't want it to be really in your face. I wanted to sort of to show the humanity in these people and the sort of disfigurement to be secondary to that. So I kind of spoke to the charity, and the process was that we had a meeting. I then spoke to the charity about what I wanted to do. We then went away. My agent and them agreed a budget and a timeline to how we'd make the work. And then they came up with a list of potential people. A lot of them were already ambassadors for the charity, but I felt it was really important to have kind of a wide cross section of people and a wide cross section of the sorts of injuries that they deal with. It's still kind of an ongoing project, so there are gaps within that. But for instance, she was a victim of an acid attack after her boyfriend, her ex-boyfriend, hired thugs to pour acid in her face. If we can go backwards. So she got bathwater burns when she was a baby. Similarly, I think she was 3 years old and was scalded. She was again a child and got her pyjamas caught fire, and she had 35% burns. And whereas you can just see she's got a prosthetic ear, the woman previous.
Sorry.
So that is completely false. She's now a doctor.
Is it 'cause they like my gangster talk? Ooh. Is it 'cause they like my handsome face? Is it 'cause they like my gangster way? To your right behind you, security behind you.
Ronnie, get up on stage with us, come on.
Man, they got real pips around here.
Dennis Hoff owns 2 brothels in the state of Nevada. He's been invited to the ball with his porn star girlfriend, Sunset Thomas.
And y'all know Dennis Hoff from the Bunny Ranch, Sunshine Thomas. And listen,
His relentless promotion of legalized prostitution earns him respect among the players.
Man, this nigga got 250 hoes deep. 250.
Dennis has 250 girls on his books because he can. Nevada is the only state in America where prostitution is legal. Rappers have made pimp culture cool. It's an illicit world traditionally dominated by blacks with attitude.
Don't stop. I need a rap name of anything pimp, huh?
Dennis is the only white pimp recognized by the players.
Ain't no party like the Bunny Ranch party, cause the Bunny Ranch party don't stop. Y'all say it. Ain't no party like the Bunny Ranch party, cause the Bunny Ranch party don't stop. Ain't no party like the Bunny Ranch party, cause the Bunny Ranch party don't stop. Y'all right. Ain't no party like the Bunny Ranch party, cause the Bunny Ranch party don't stop. How about this? There ain't no titties like sunset titties, cause sunset titties don't stop. Y'all say it. Ain't no titties like sunset titties, cause sunset titties don't stop. Ain't no titties like sunset titties, because sunset titties don't stop. That's all they real too. And they real too.
Holes to the right, holes to the left. 5 holes this time.
closed world. Pimps come from all over the states to receive awards from their peers for the truest, the most promising, and the most consistent pimp of the year. The biggest award of the night goes to Pimp Jojo and his harem of 8 girls.
Alright, Pimp Jojo, the new king of the pimp. Pimp Jojo.
All the pimps in the house, keep doing what you're doing, cause y'all got the spirit moving in the rap game, and we loving y'all for what y'all do. God bless y'all and God keep you. Pimp, 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 church.
There may be respect for the white boy from Nevada, but there's no award for him to take home.
And they made us feel like we were homeboys.
That's right, homeboys.
We were like part of the hood.
We are in the hood, brother. And they had every hood rat in the world was there tonight, believe me. But what fun. Very flamboyant. It's a part of America that nobody will ever see. And I love it. I've never seen so many mink coats. I'm going to have an air conditioner in my mink coat. I'm going to have one special made with an air conditioner.
I always wanted to be a pimp, but it always cost me money.
You're selling pictures of girls.
No, but I tried being a pimp when I was 19, man. I mean, I had this hope, and I thought I was the greatest guy to give to women, you know? I mean, she took me to school, man. She cost me a fortune. I didn't make a dime. So I gave up my pimping career a long time ago.
Stuck taking pictures, huh?
Okay, so that was just a very tiny slice. It's a bit flamboyant, this one, but I've already shown at Bournemouth a couple of...
This woman was injured. She had a gunshot wound to the face whilst diving to protect her wife, and then subsequently had facial cancer. So pretty interesting story. And then also had facial cancer and lost his eye, and he gave up on wearing a prosthetic and just wears an eye patch now. What I've always tried to do, and I think what I sort of tried to sort of impart on the students this morning, was I always tried to do something a little bit unexpected. So I didn't want it to be really stark and in your face, and I didn't want the people to kind of also look like victims. I just wanted them to be humans and treat them as I would any other sort of subject matter that I'd take into the studio. But I also wanted them to be kind of soft and so I shot them on 5:4 film, and so this is again going back to like why I didn't sort of, this was unexpected as contemporary documentary photography, was that, you know, these are lit, they're styled, they're directed. I shot them on 5:4 film, I chose the background, they came to the location, so it's not classically what I expect to be termed as documentary photography. Which I suppose then, if we go on to the next subject, and this really stretches kind of the ideas of documentary photography, and I probably wouldn't term it as documentary photography. In 2013, I was approached by Channel 4, and they were promoting the Grand National for Channel 4 Racing, and they've got an advertising arm called 4 Creative. So an art director came to me with an idea about how we celebrate the jockeys who are like these unsung heroes of horse racing, because they're so seldom seen because they're wearing goggles and hats and they're all tucked down, so you never really see them celebrated. And they wanted to show the tagline was the original extreme sport, because these guys go to really extreme lengths in pursuit of their sport and their athletes. So the focus was purely on them. Again, it was a little bit more restricted process, but I still had creative freedom. and we were both very keen to make them look as real as possible. But again, I think with background information, it kind of heaps meaning, and I've always been intentionally vague about these photographs because I don't like people to kind of have a sort of a prejudice when they view them. So I think most people would kind of view this initially and they'd see kind of maybe a day-lit documentary project, but in actual fact, to get the extreme conditions we wanted, these are all staged. So the mud, he was the only one that was actually racing that day. So we were at a race course and we recce'd the changing rooms, but in reality the changing rooms weren't that great, the access wasn't going to be that great. So we needed the ability to pull people off the race course. So we built a changing room next door in a cafe, and some of the people like Daryl, I think, was racing. So he was the previous year's Grand National winner. But if we go back to Katie, so she wasn't racing, she came especially for the shoot. We chose the silk, so I chose the colour of the background. The art director and myself researched mud spatter and how that reacted, and the sort of chafing of the skin and the dry lips. So all of this is recreated. And the final photo of AP McCoy was, he very famously got kicked in the face. Is there one more? No. Oh, okay. AP McCoy's not up there, but there's a picture of a guy with a scar running up, like a fresh scar running all the way up his face where he got double kicked in the face, and that was all prosthetics. So I suppose my point is, is this documentary? I'm not sure. And then your knowledge of that information maybe affects how you perceive them. But I think they're still honest. They are retellings of things that actually happened. They just didn't happen when we photographed them. So they're sort of making a documentary film and making a reenactment, that sort of thing. So on to the final stuff. This was again a charity. This was for Save the Children. So an art director there came to me with the idea that they were going to launch their first UK campaign, which they'd never done before, and she wanted to do like a photo booth situation in all the most impoverished areas in the UK. And again, it was a discussion. It wasn't like we have to do this. So I kind of said, well, for me to be involved, it kind of needs to be more photographic than that. I don't want to just kind of set something up and go away. So we decided instead to I'd build a studio and collaborate with the kids on how they'd have their portraits taken, and then sort of add to that, they then wrote a statement on what they thought it was like to be in poverty in the UK. So it was like an inclusive thing where they would come, they would talk to Lynn for a while, they'd write their piece, and then they'd come and we'd sort of agree on a photograph and take the photograph together. So yeah, the idea developed into this, and so the reality of the situation was we had 2 days in a boys and girls club in Poplar. I set up a studio, so I probably spent half of the first day just setting up my lighting in the studio, and then kids it was kind of a boxing club and a youth club, so kids that would come there every day, and this was the most impoverished district in London and one of the most impoverished places in the country. So the kids would then come and have their portraits taken, write their piece, and then I took the pieces away and re-photographed them, so they'd be shown as diptychs alongside each of the children. So I suppose what working, the thing I was talking about, what unified them, and them all being commissions, what that kind of offered me as opposed to doing my personal work was, they kind of offer you a support network. So working with the charities, they do a lot of the legwork for you. They contact the people, they make the access possible. Whereas, and I think me and Zed were talking about it over lunch, was if you're doing this personally, like I'd say 90% of the time is spent in front of the computer trying to either raise money or get access granted. And I spoke to a lot of the students this morning about sort of that being a very difficult thing, especially when you're in education. If access takes you a year, then you've got no time left to make your project. So what working with a charity or someone like Channel 4 does for you is it gains you access that you would never normally have, and it offers you, so probably from 10% of your time spent on creativity turns into like 50 or 100% of your time, because you just have to think about the pictures. So that's kind of the nice thing about this, and I've always taken, when I take on commissions like this, I don't take a different approach to if it was my personal work or if it was a job for Channel 4. I'm always want to create something that's like, could be seen as art and could be seen as commercial, and you know has a soul as aside from that. The question I suppose it all raises is what is contemporary documentary photography. Like, I personally don't see the Channel 4 stuff as documentary photography, but I don't mind if someone does. What's nice is that it's been accepted as art, and it has been, you know, maybe it's misleading to think that it's documentary, but people have accepted it as documentary. And I quite like that vagueness, to not add prejudice to it by telling people that this was all staged. Because I don't think it matters, it is a reenactment. And, you know, to the same degree, I still influenced these pictures. I still lit them, I still told them where to stand. When they look at the camera, you know, that's still a staging of an image. So, I mean, it's not the same as going into their environment and taking a stolen photograph of them. But I think somehow it makes them more potent and makes you it strips the image back and makes you concentrate on the subject. So I think I'm always looking for an original way to tell a story, and not necessarily, say, for instance, with the work with the scars. I don't necessarily want to shock someone, because I think all that does is make you want to look away from the picture. I'd much prefer someone sees a beautiful picture and then engages with the story and spends time with it than, I think we're so kind of trained to seeing things like disaster porn and that sort of thing, where you just, your initial reaction is to look at something hideous and look away. I'd much rather make a hideous subject look beautiful and engage people for longer. I think that's probably about all the speaking I'll do, but I'd love some questions if people have questions. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question about your process, in the process of you taking your images.
Yeah.
It's very purposeful in the way you like them and your intentions. But when you come down to the final selection, how do you select that one image from the shoot as a representation?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes, like I often have a preconceived idea of how I want a picture to look, but a lot of it does come down to the edit. So, and I mean, these are all shot on film. The Save the Children stuff was shot on medium format film, and both the other projects were shot on large format film. But because I had agency with me, I did shoot them digitally as well. So they saw a digital image on the screen, so they were happy that they were getting what they wanted. And then I kind of took my 5.4 or my medium format and then shot what I wanted to shoot. But interestingly, the agency still picked the film stuff that I loved, and the digital stuff was kind of just seen as like Polaroid. I've only done that a few times, like usually it has to be one or the other. But I suppose in answer to your question, it's kind of 50-50, like I know when I'm shooting it what's working, but then there'll be surprises afterwards when you get the contact sheets back. And you kind of just have a guttural reaction to something that's what you wanted.
Working class. Whereas within your images, it's almost the antithesis of that, and they've become almost classless. And I was wondering if that was intentional.
Yeah, I think it's kind of across the board intentional with my work. Is like there's this horrible term that they use in America about poverty porn, where people kind of go out and sort of all kind of swarm on the impoverished areas. And I didn't want it. I wanted it to be more empowering for them. It was like I didn't want to kind of It's always hard because you're a photographer and you've got to convey a message, but again, like, as with the scar stuff, I didn't want to kind of go, oh yeah, these are the poor children, feel sorry for them. I wanted it to be ambiguous enough for it to be an open narrative, but also explicit enough for you to get what the subject matter was about. And I think that what they've written was kind of enough that the portraits didn't have to be that poverty porn.
Should we stop there and then save more questions for the end?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so sorry to be a fumbling fool.
Hi. I'm going to go, actually Paul, I'm going to go straight into one of the documentary films I shot for the BBC Oh, it was a 10-part series, so not that.
No, I'm going to find it.
It was shot in 2000 and it took 2.5 years to do 10 films. And I lived for the best part of a year in 2 different brothels in Nevada. So I was pretty much out of the way, which is the best way to learn your subject matter. I'm not suggesting go to a brothel, but you know what I mean. So I'm going to show, if you want to, this is 1 of 10, and this is the Pimp Master General.
The Players' Ball is a convention for pimps. Held once a year in Chicago, it's the social event of the year for all the big players, their hoes from the street, and rap artists like Snoop Doggy Dogg.
Hey players, here it goes. Hey, give me that pimp music.
I've got hoes in different area codes.
It's the pimp equivalent of the Oscars. Awards are given for excellence and outstanding achievement.
Is it 'cause they like my gangster walk?